Now let's revisit our country level reference map that we started working on earlier. Following the instructions from the previous screencast, I just applied a coordinate system that is appropriate for the area that we are mapping. In this case, I picked a national grid for Spain. But now our map, while it looks largely ready for publication and output, is still missing some common map elements. Among these common map elements are feature labels. Many reference maps include text labels that indicate the names or other characteristics of features included in the map. And while not every feature is labeled in any typical map, a reference map like this would certainly have some labels on it. Those labels could include city names, it could include river names, or it could include the names of countries. So let's experiment with this and learn how we can apply labels to different kinds of features. Let's begin and work our way up from point labels to line labels, and then finally to polygon labels. Turning on labeling within ArcMap is very straightforward, and despite the fact that it might seem like a complex task, like with other things, since it is such a common need, ArcMap does not require you to manually place labels. Instead, there is an automated label placement engine built into the software. The first thing we want to do when thinking about labeling a layer is to think about what field we want to use for labeling it. Indeed, we most often use the values of attribute fields to label features. And in this case, if we look at the attribute table for our point countries layer, we could see that the name field here contains the names of the capital cities. So in that case, we could just open up our properties, go to the Labels tab, choose Label Features in this layer. For now, we can keep all settings set to label features the same way, and we would choose the name field. Hit Apply, and then we can see here that text labels are added to our map. Very simple, very easy. There are ways to customize label placement, of course, but for this simple point layer, we can keep the default settings. In this case, though, I am much more concerned about making the text labels appear the way that we would want them to. So we have this label set up right now for our cities. The text is kind of small. Maybe we could make it a little larger. Maybe we could make it bold. These are capital cities after all. That looks a little bit better. And do note that it is possible to customize the symbol even further by clicking on Symbol. Within there, you can pick any number of pre-existing styles, or you could even choose Edit Symbol to customize it to a greater extent. You can customize the font, you can customize the offset from the point, you can format the text by using all capital letters or all lowercase letters. You can use a fill color for the text if you like, and you can add what's called a mask, so you could add a halo around the labels to provide a little visual separation between the labels and the content around them. I often like doing that, particularly when the labels overlap complex features like the coastlines that we see here. So with that, we have labeled our capital cities, and this map is really starting to come together. Now let's move up to labeling line features. In this case, the line feature that we would label would be rivers. Again, we want to begin by looking at the attribute table to see what river name field might be available. And sure enough, like in many cases, we have a field here called Name that we can use. We will open up the Properties, go to the Labels tab, label all features, choose Name, and then hit Apply. As you can see, the labels of the rivers generally follow the rivers. This is a default option that is provided for line and polygon features. Normally, when you label polygon features, the labeling engine will try to place the label at a central point in the polygon. And when labeling line features, typically the labels will follow the curvature of the line. In this case, though, we still will want to make some additional customization. Note that there are several different major categories of fonts available on most computers. There are sans serif fonts, which are fonts like the ones we see here, which do not contain any tails or additional frills or features on text characters. And then there are serif fonts, which typically do contain some sort of feet, tails, things like that on each one of the letters within the character system. An example of a serif font, in contrast to the sans serif Arial font, would be Times New Roman. As you can see, if we look at this sample here of Times New Roman text, every one of the characters has caps on the tops and feet on the bottom and tails on the ends of the letters. Typically, if we use sans serif fonts to label features like cities, so political features or countries, then we would want to use sans serif fonts to label physical features like rivers. So we could change our font over to Times New Roman. Maybe we could make it a little bit larger, 10 points. On second thought, maybe keeping it a little bit smaller would be better. And then make the text italic. That's also a convention for labeling rivers that I see frequently. And given the circumstances, we can then choose the same color that we use to represent the rivers. So we can go in here and look up what our color is. For RGB, we have 10, 147, 252. Or here we have 206, 96, 99 for HSV. That's a little easier. So I'll remember that. We'll go back into labeling our rivers. HSV, 206, 96, 99. We will hit apply. And just as easily as that, we will have visually appropriate labels added to our rivers. There are some cases in which our labels are a little bit difficult to read, so we might even consider using a different sans serif font, and this will just be a matter of experimentation also to see what looks best. Another good sans serif font that sometimes can be a little clearer and easier to read is Georgia. And now that I picked that, I can believe that that is a little bit more readable than the Times New Roman that we used before. If you're ever concerned about the readability or the density of your label text, you can always edit the symbol and add some spacing in between your characters. That happens here under formatted text, and you could just turn up character spacing a little bit, maybe to 15, just to give some space in between these letters and make them a little bit easier to read. I think that does wonders for making this even clearer. Then finally, we can label the countries themselves. For polygon labeling, it works essentially the same way. We would just open up the labeling features here. We would choose name, which again is the name of the field that stores the names of the countries. And then just like with everything else, we can customize the appearance. Note that if we label everything with the default settings, our label will not necessarily look too visually appropriate. In many cases, we have to be a little more creative with the labeling in order to ensure that we are labeling everything appropriately. If we open up the Symbol tab, you can see that there are some options here for labeling countries. Some are a little less conventional than others. Even just choosing this non-default option makes things look a little bit better. So that's a nice improvement already. Nonetheless, I think we could do even better. If I just choose country 3 right here, and then transform the text to all be uppercase, so we'll choose all caps. That can be a nice improvement. And then I might also add some spacing to the characters as well. If we change our character spacing to perhaps 30, let it breathe a little bit. That looks nice. And now the one thing that is still standing out as not working so well from my perspective is the label color. So we can make this blend in much more with the colors that we're using in other places in the map. So for this, I'll take a look at this and think maybe if I just take this color that we have here and make it a little bit darker, so take the outline color perhaps and try that first. We'll see how that is. So 68, 15, 59. 68, 15, 59. Let's see how that looks. Didn't apply. Let's try again. Excellent. That blends in much better. We could even stand to make that a little bit darker, though. So we could just take the value down a bit. Maybe not too much. Could set it right at 50 if we're going to stick with a nice round number. That pops out even more without being too overwhelming. Note that in addition to the features that we have labeled, there are some that we haven't. We could always, if we wanted to, turn on labels for the smaller cities as well. That's always an option, and you could just turn on labeling in a very simple way. Note that this can make our map kind of dense, though, and so it's really up to you in a specific circumstance to determine whether you wish to turn on labeling for all features or just some. To me, though, this density does not look too bad, so we could stick with it and go from there. Do note that we also have some labels here that are not necessarily looking very good based on the size of the features. The small territory of Gibraltar, the small Principality of Andorra, and the city-state of Monaco all have country-level labels, as they are individual countries, yet we have some essentially duplication in those cases, and I would recommend removing those labels. We would do so, however, in another mode of mapping, so we'll move forward to the next stage wherein we're creating print layouts, and at that point we can actually convert those labels to graphics that we could then delete those of that we do not want to include in our final outcome.